Hello and welcome to Forbidden History Radio, where we explore humanity's hidden history, out-of-place artifacts, lost civilizations, and startling evidence that the truth is being suppressed.
Let me tell you a little bit about Dean and get him on the air because, as I said, I got this big list of questions. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about is the Hollow Earth theory, which we've tried to do before, but just has not moved forward. And so I think this is going to be really cool and interesting. Dean Dominic De Lucia studied business administration at the University of Baltimore and later on completed a 2-year course in translating at the Catholic University in São Paulo, Brazil, where he currently resides. He has maintained a lifelong interest in Indian/Hindu philosophy and spiritual practices, which ultimately led him to take up Vedic astrology. Dane maintains a unique perspective, one of presenting pure Vedic astrology in its original form without hodgepodging it with other systems. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio, the author of The Hollow Earth and the Puranas, his website, holloworbs.com, Dean Dominic De Lucia. Hey, Dean, how are you?
Well, Dr. Rita, I'm doing just fine. I'd like to thank you for bringing me on your show, and I'd like to say I think that I'm really going to enjoy it.
Well, good. I think it's going to be great. I am always prepared for all of my interviews. I always have, a handful of questions, and I sat down and started going through your material, and it was like, okay, here's another one. Oop, here's another one. Oop, here's another one. And like I said, I feel scratched the surface, so I'm really I'm not really glad that Jerry's not feeling good, but I'm really glad that I have you for both hours because it'll give us more time to visit and go deeper into this whole topic, which seems kind of huge, but no one really knows about. So before we get into the whole thing, how did you become interested in the whole concept of a hollow earth?
Well, I was very interested in alternative astronomy, always. I have telescopes. I've had telescopes for maybe 25 years now. And I'm I've always had an alternative perspective. I don't know, maybe I'm a bit of a wrangler or something. But even back in the 70s, I was very dubious about this whole Apollo idea. And, of course, I ran across the face on Mars, the Hoagland material like that. And I always used to peruse the Internet and look at alternative astronomy material. And then I found some material on the Hollow Earth, and I started reading about it. And it rang a bell. A few of the issues that I had with the Vedas, with specifically the Puranic literature, were answered by this idea of the earth being hollow. And I decided to investigate it a little bit further, and I found out more than I ever imagined. Let's put it that way.
So when we say hollow, do you mean like an empty sphere? Something like, when I think of it, the first thing that comes to mind is that book, Journey to the Center of the Earth, where they go down and they get to the middle of the Earth, and as opposed to being molten magma, it's, this got a little ocean and some trees, and there's kind of a sun in the background. That's the imagery that comes to mind. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, there are two concepts, and that is one of them, really, that the Earth is a cavity, that the Earth is hollow, the crust of the Earth is a shell. There are orifices, openings at the polar extremes, and inside the environment is actually very nice. That's what's been reported. Now, the other concept is a concept that we call cavern worlds. And cavern worlds are worlds within the crust, cities within the crust. Some of these have been reported by UFO abductees.
Which is a topic we're going to get totally into.
Sure.
Based on what you've read, which do you feel is more realistic, practical, or are you still on the fence? Is it a big hollow Earth, no magma core, or do you think it's more these subterranean realms, or could it be both?
Oh no, definitely both. Definitely both exist. The one, how do you say, difference of opinion that I've had to juggle is which has a stronger, more immediate impact on us living on the surface of the Earth. And I definitely think that the cavern world's concept, the cavern world's reality, I'll put it that way, has a very direct and immediate impact on us living on the surface of the Earth.
All right, I'm going to bite. Why would...
Okay.
I was kind of wanting to hold off on this piece of conversation. We will go here right now. Why would it have more of an immediate impact on us?
Well, because we're closer to those worlds, and I think we're more immediately accessible by them. For example, just to give one example, let's think about the chupacabras. Now, the chupacabras, they don't live in the clouds. Let's put it that way. They're not above us. They don't live in the sky, and to tell you the truth, they don't live around us either, or else their habitat would have been discovered by now. There would have been more sightings, something like that. So if they're not above us and they don't have an existence laterally, where do they exist? Where do they live? They must live below. And in this way, there are many creatures that live below us in these cavern worlds. They've been typically reported in folklore, definitely in European folklore, and now I'm speaking about Tolkien. Now I'm speaking about goblins. I'm speaking about gnomes. I'm speaking about trolls. I'm speaking about fairies. I'm speaking about elves and their activities and their impact and their manipulations on or of the surface world, and also the Bigfoot. We're speaking about the Bigfoot here. Bigfoot has been seen. There's a wonderful, how would you say, a wonderful explanation of the Bigfoot in this book by Cremo, Forbidden Archaeology. In the appendix, he reproduces this Russian account of a Russian division that was in Afghanistan. This was back in the 1920s, because they also had some military activity in Afghanistan in the 20s. And this Russian division encountered some insurgents, and there was a battle, and the insurgents took to the mountains, they took to the caves, and they went deep in the caves. And they were met by a whole tribe of Bigfoot, and they had a battle inside the caves, and the Russians were outside, and they came running out, and they surrendered. They surrendered to the Russians. When they were being interrogated, they explained to the Russians, to their horror, what they encountered in these caves, the types of beings. The Russians went in there, and they found one of them shot dead, pulled him out. They had a doctor with him. The doctor conducted an autopsy. This thing was about 9 feet tall. It had whitish hair. It had a pinkish face. It had a face which was much more of a man's face, definitely a man's face, rather than a simian face or gorilla face, nothing like that. And, this was an autopsy signed by a medical doctor, and the general or colonel, whoever was this military officer. So this right there gives you an idea of how immediate our contact can be, has been at times, with these creatures living in cavern worlds right below our feet. Whereas the hollow world, is very far away. It's difficult to access, and I don't know. To me, it just seems more distant. It seems like something I'll never encounter. I'll never go there, but I know about it. Something like that.
The stories that you're sharing of these creatures that live in present day, I'll just say, they sound, I'm going to say, kind of kooky. Like, what have you been smoking this week? However, I have a big however. When you look at mythology, there are, as you say, there are stories upon stories upon stories of these subterranean worlds and these people that inhabit these realms, but then they just kind of stop talking about it. You don't hear about it anymore, so you figure, they just say all the mythology is a bunch of hooey anyway, and if you believe that the mythology is true, you must be crazy too.
Yeah, well, mythology, and I think a closer word to us would be folklore. These beings have always existed in folklore, in European folklore. And it's not. It seems so far away. Like it's turned into fairy tale. It's turned into myth. But it wasn't myth when these things were written down. It wasn't myth when these things were experienced by the people. There's a lot of them. I think we could talk about a few of them. Even the Pied Piper of Hamelin. This is a fairy tale for children. It's in Grimm's fairy tales. But this was, they included it for children. They put it in their fairy tale book. But this existed before as a true account. It's just that it's been so long now. It's been something like 800 years that it's kind of difficult to verify. But some of the, some of the characteristics of these stories we've heard before. The children were enchanted. There was some frequency that was employed. They were hypnotized. The mountain opened up. The children walked in. The mountain closed again. We've run across this before, even in the Tibetan folklore, about some of the entrances to the cavern worlds, how they've been closed up with boulders, and the people know where they are, more or less, but nobody goes there. They don't know how to open the door. They don't know what the mantras are, or the frequencies, that kind of thing. But are these stories really myth, or are they reality? It's just been so long.
Well, but there are even people that claim that in Dulce, New Mexico, there's an underground government installation, but inside that installation, there are beings or creatures that live there, that have lived there, and we just kind of found them and created some kind of an agreement that we could hang out with them.
Well, I don't know what the specifics are, but I have no doubt that these creatures live in these cavern worlds below the earth. And I know that our government and also the Russian government, they have been excavating and digging and establishing underground cities with black funds for a few decades now. I can remember reading about things like that in the 70s, these underground cities that they have. If you think about it, think about the continental drift theory. You've got these plates sitting on top of the crust, and apparently there's some movement. Well, the plates are not smooth. Of course, they're going to be jagged underneath. Imagine all the scratching and scraping that must go on. Certainly, you're going to have hollows. You're going to have openings, caverns that open up. They're scratched out between these two surfaces because of the friction. And they're going to be maybe a mile or so high, and they're going to be maybe 25, 30, or maybe 50 miles long. That's not so incomprehensible. There's certainly water down there. And as far as the omnipresent light that we've heard so much about from Tibetan folklore, that could have a scientific basis too.
Explain that, because that's one of the places I always get stuck is, sort of using something that is luminescent in nature. How do they get light down there?
Well, first of all, there are some creatures that do not use photons. Their eyes are not sensitive to photons, or rather, they may be sensitive to photons, but they're also sensitive to other particles. Photons apparently bounce off the surface of the Earth because they are so small. But there are other particles that pass right through. So these cave entities that were found by the Russian patrol, and also, for example, cats can see in the dark. Their eyes are apparently picking up on other particles down there. They have their sunshine, which is different from our sunshine, so to speak. So first of all, there's that. But then there's one Hollow Earth writer, and he's a physicist, Joseph H. Cater, and his theory is that these particles from the sun that pass through the Earth, of course they're electrons, but his theory is that electrons are actually made up of photons, and that as they pass through the Earth's crust, there is friction because of forces opposed, and they begin to fragment and break up. And this is what we hear from some of the few travelers, the few accounts that we have of people who have actually claimed to have accessed these worlds, that as you penetrate and as you go down through the Earth's crust, and we're talking about maybe even like 25, 30 miles, we've heard some figures like that a certain luminescence omnipresent luminescence just starts to manifest. And this would be the particles from the sun passing through the Earth, breaking up into their constituent photons, and that would account for luminosity at a certain strata, at a certain level. So if you have an opening, if you have light, and if you have water down there working its way through the rocks and in the middle of the Earth's crust somewhere, then why can't you have life? Those are all the ingredients.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about people that have actually gone to the center of the Earth, you're talking about the book, which I actually have read, which I thought was interesting, that Olaf Jansen guy.
Right, Olaf Jansen. Well, Olaf Jansen, he passed through with his father, Jens Jansen, he passed through the hollow opening in the middle of the Arctic Ocean into the cavity. And that's the illumination there is maybe a little different, but I'm speaking of actual cavern worlds, accessed through caves like that. There are various stories. The Makuxi Indians in Brazil, they have a whole folklore about their origin being these underground worlds that they used to access once a year. They would travel down through the cave systems that they knew, and at a certain depth, this light would start manifesting. There's the book Etidorpa, which is Aphrodite spelled backwards, but that's the account of a man in Ohio. We actually think we know who he is, a Captain Henry Morgan, who was originally from northern New York, but he was abducted and he was brought on a journey through a tunnel system, and he passed through several cavern worlds, and he related that the force of gravity begins to diminish with depth as you pass through the crust, as you go very deep, and that also light begins to manifest, a certain luminescence, omnipresent luminescence just begins to manifest all around you. So these are the accounts that I was referring to. Olaf Jansen is very interesting too, but he was in the cavity. Okay. And the cavity, the hollow cavity, it would be like this, the illumination of the hollow cavity. Really, the sun's particles pass through the crust completely, and they'll get trapped inside the cavity, and they'll bounce around inside, and they'll begin to fragment and crack up there too. I guess the idea is similar. And then they'll congregate in the center because they'll be repulsed by the gravity from the inner surface on all sides around, and they'll congregate in the middle, and they'll form this sun, this inner sun that Olaf related. Not exactly like the sun of our solar system. He called it a copper color sun, and it was very diffuse, and it just sat there in the middle of the hollow opening. But it would be a conglomeration then of these particles that are breaking up and releasing their photons.
I know that Admiral Byrd tells a story about going into the center of the Earth. When you look at the two stories next to each other, Olaf's story and Admiral Byrd's, do you see parallels and similarities between the two?
Well, what I understand from Admiral Byrd's story is that he was there were beings there, they were advanced, they had technology, and there was light and there was greenery, there was vegetation. He didn't really give much of an account, number one. Number two, I'll tell you the truth, I shy away quite a bit. Actually, I shy away from both of them. I shy away from Olaf Jansen and from Byrd. Certainly from Byrd, much more. I avoid Byrd, and I'll tell you why. There's no proof whatsoever. There's no document, there's no letter, there's no recording. They say there was a film that was shown, the trailers that they used to have back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. When you go to the cinema, they would show a newsreel first before the movie would start. They say that there was a newsreel of Admiral Byrd and the camera from his airplane and showing, scenes from the hollow earth, the vegetation and things like that. But there's nobody can find one, nobody can see it. And when you start to
government
present, certainly, I don't doubt that he went, and I don't doubt that there's a government cover-up. But you get on thin ice when you start proposing a hollow earth theory like that, and that this man did this and this man did that, and you simply have nothing to show for it. Nothing under your feet, no basis for it. And it's very similar with Olaf Jansen. All we have is this book, which was written by a third party. The author's name was Emerson. It was spoken by Olaf Jansen to him on Olaf's deathbed. And we don't even have any records that anybody's been able to find of Olaf's birth in Scandinavia, in I believe it was Norway, or his family, or anything. There's just nothing. It's just a story. It's third-party evidence, and I personally take stock in Olaf Jansen's story very much. It's very descriptive, but it's not the kind of thing that I personally base my arguments on, if you know what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But, to me, once you start listening to these stories and you get an overpreponderance of evidence from multiple sources, all kind of saying similar things. The hollow earth, going into the hollow earth, not so many stories. The subterranean cavity world, a lot more material to compare and contrast and pay attention to. But when you start getting so much material from so many different people and so many different sources, you have to start taking a step back and going, is there really something going on with this, or is it just an entire planet's imagination?
Well, I'll agree with you on that, but at the same time, we have a nice situation that we do have hard, cold evidence to fall back on, and we have a preponderance of it. When it comes to the hollow earth, especially the Arctic opening, and the Arctic body of evidence, there's a lot.
But, people say that, then it brings in that whole conspiracy thing. People say, well, I've gone on and on Google Earth, and I don't see anything, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is a topic. I got very interested in the whole subterranean world, which kind of brought in the hollow earth theory, which is why I guess I know more about it than I even thought that I knew about it. And like going through your stuff, it's like, wait, I already knew that.
Well, Google Earth is not, first of all, is not scientific, Google Earth. It's not a research grade program or instrument. They don't claim that. And then here's Google Earth presenting images of an area which is a security area. It's an exclusive area. It's a DEW area, the Defense Early Warning Area. Mm-hmm. And it's an area where there is censorship. There is definitely censorship of images. And they admit that. Their military has a right. And you have to take any Google Earth of that area with a grain of salt, first of all. But then we have found a few images, a few film clips, certainly of the southern opening, not so clear of the northern opening, but we've got a couple of good ones of the southern opening, of the aurora emanating from shall we say, a hole in the ground in the middle of the Antarctic continent. And also we have a kind of a close-up, let's say a medium close-up of that opening, thanks to the RadarSat mapping program. So we have research-grade, quality, documented evidence, even modern evidence, scientific, astronomical satellite evidence. We do have that. And it's much more dependable than Google Earth. Of course, we're on a radio show, unfortunately. Otherwise, maybe we would pass some film clips and
well, if
show
somebody
that.
were interested in looking at these pictures or checking out the film clips, do you have like a link on your website, or how could they kind of explore that more?
Well, there's a couple ways. There's actually one very easy way, and that's to go on Yahoo Groups and look up the All Planets-Hollow group on Yahoo Groups. That's All Planets, it's all together without any space, -Hollow. Get on and just say, hey, Dean, I'm interested in seeing these film clips of the southern opening. I mean, that's one easy way. But then my site is www.holloorbs.com/Antarctic Auroras 123. And that's the page address. They can get to it. Yeah.
Great. One of the things that I find interesting in my kind of exploration of these subterranean worlds is that they have been finding or have found, but, of course, they don't show these really on TV. You have to really dig to find some of this stuff. Sculptures of, I'm going to say humans, they look humanoid, except as opposed to having eyes that are almond-shaped, they're big and round eyes, and when I look at them, the question my husband has had is, well, if they could do all of this great stuff, then why couldn't they represent us with the right-shaped eyes? And my comment back is, well, maybe we needed a different kind of optical apparatus because we were underground.
Okay, you're referring to what sculptures? The Aztecs or the Egyptians?
No, these are ones that have been found. Some in Ecuador, I think. We had Klaus Donna on the show, and some of his material. He's somebody you need to check out because he's found a lot of stuff in Ecuador and Colombia that are just bizarre. But these humanoid figures with these big round eyes, and then this thing, which I think you will love, he has found these pieces. Some of them are like pyramid shaped, some of them are these cups, and they have inlay in them. And what they have discovered is, and I'm not sure if this is the only light frequency, but if you shine black light on these figures where the inlaid is, they glow in the dark like a black light poster. Really interesting. Really interesting. And I'm going, well, if you're in a subterranean world, you maybe want something that, glows in the dark.
Right, okay. My personal feelings on these Andean and also Aztec Indians, at Machu Picchu, for example, and also Mexico City when the Spaniards first arrived there, is that these places were like outposts. They were openings from the cavern worlds below, deep inside these Andean mountains. And that Machu Picchu, for example, was a kind of outpost, and people lived there, and they guarded the entrance. And they marshaled the Indians. They organized the Indian tribes around them, which were different tribes. The Incas, they were very big, very strong, square-shouldered. They were more like a warrior caste. And the other Indians around them were a simpler type of people. But they seemed to command the area around them and the area around the opening, and they had a permanent outpost there on top. That's my take on them. But the creatures who live below, I imagine there are various types of humanoid creatures which are, half human, half reptile, something like that. Like the Nagas, for example. They have this description.
But the Nagas are out of India, not out of South America. They have their own name, but, where you hear that word, that term, it usually comes out of Hindu tradition.
Sure. And the creatures that live below the surface in the Andes in South America, they might be a whole different race, a whole different type of being. It's true. The Nagas, however, I think that the Nagas stretch all the way over to Europe. I feel that the account, and this I originally got from Mike Mott. He's also one of the Grave Distractions authors. He has a book called Caverns, Cauldrons, and Concealed Creatures, and he speaks a lot about underground worlds. But he feels that Nimue of the legend of Arthur in Camelot, he feels that Nimue was a Naga, because the Nagas, they have been described as assuming human form, and they're very magical. They have command of all sorts of mysticism. They have a desire, or they have a history of influencing events on the surface of the world, and apparently they live underwater. They live below lakes. They live below riverbeds, and they've also been encountered along the shores of oceans. So apparently the Nagas, this Naga civilization, stretches across the Indo-European world from India to the British Isles. That's, one interesting observation I'll make.
One of the things that I find very interesting, talking about the Vedic tradition, is that when they talk about groups like the Nagas, there are the Devas, who are the good gods,
right.
And then there are the Nagas and the Asuras, who are the bad gods, and when they talk about many of the groups of the Asuras, they all live underground.
Yes, they do. Definitely. Their abode is the subterranean world, and the abode of the gods are celestial planets, other planets above the plane of the solar system. But even it seems in the upper atmosphere of the earth, when you read the Puranic narrations about the activities of the Krishna avatar, they were witnessed by angelic creatures who lived above the clouds. It seems that they lived in the stratosphere, perhaps in the ultraviolet frequency, and they would shower flowers upon the Krishna avatar when he would defeat a demon or create some superordinary act or activity. But they would. They were witnessing him, these godlike beings from above. So that's there, the angelic creatures who live high in the atmosphere, and the demonic creatures who live below us in the depths and in the bowels of the earth. That's definitely there. I think
the beings that live in the sky, just one little follow-up question. Do you think they live in the third dimension, or do you think they live in some higher dimensional plane?
Well, I don't think much in terms of dimensions. I've been very influenced by Joseph Cater, and he speaks of frequency worlds of higher frequency,
that's
and worlds of lower frequency.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I think they live in a higher frequency world, and I think that we could be in the same room with them, so to speak, or we could fly up in one of our aircraft and pass through their world, and we wouldn't be perceived by them, and they wouldn't perceive us, not necessarily. But yeah, I think they're there. The subterranean, how would you say, abodes of the demoniac creatures, that's actually very well documented. It's brought up a lot in the Vedic literature, in the Puranic literature. If you'd like, I could actually run a few descriptions by your listeners.
Sure.
Well, first of all, I think it would be interesting to mention Arjuna of the Bhagavad Gita. The Gita is interesting because everybody's heard of it, at least. You know, when I talk about the Vedic literature, everybody's heard of the Vedas, but nobody really knows what the Vedas are. You know, the Vedas are actually ritualistic literature. They're ceremonial literature. They describe how to carry out different ceremonies, how to arrange the altars, how to go about a fire sacrifice, what mantras to chant, and things like that. But then there's the Puranic literature, which is another section of the Vedic literature. And the Puranas are historical narrations of, the historical history that was interesting to that civilization, that was worth conserving and passing on to their descendants. So as part of that literature, you have the Bhagavad Gita. And in the Bhagavad Gita, you have Arjuna, the warrior. His charioteer was Krishna. The Krishna avatar agreed to become his charioteer. And on the opposing band, there was this fratricidal war because his kingdom had been usurped by his cousins when he was a child, when he was still very young. His father passed away, and his uncle took over the kingdom. Well, on the other side was Duryodhana. And when you first read the Bhagavad Gita, one of the first 2 or 3 verses, the first one who's speaking is Duryodhana. He's speaking to some of his generals on his side of the battlefield, and he's surveying this display, this military display that Arjuna has mounted on the other side. But this so everyone's familiar with the Gita. Everybody, can relate with that. This Duryodhana, he was abducted to a subterranean world. There was a time just a few years before this battle took place, when he had banished Arjuna and his brothers to the forest for 12 years. And the idea was that if he found them, they would have to add another 12 years to that and remain in the forest and not come back to claim their kingdom. So he went after them after 1 year to see if he could find them. And up in the Kashmir area, he ran across a group of Gandharvas. Gandharvas seem to be angelic beings. They have wings, and they're known for their music. These Gandharvas had cordoned off an area around a huge lake that Duryodhana wanted to go to, and they wouldn't give him access. So he became offended because he felt that this is the Earth planet and I'm the king of the Earth. He engaged in combat with them, and he was defeated and he was taken prisoner. So Arjuna, even though his cousin had become his enemy, Arjuna felt that he should use his influence with the Gandharvas to gain Duryodhana's release, and he did. This was very embarrassing to Duryodhana because he was a warrior and he had his, warrior, his chivalrous pride, that kind of thing. And he became so depressed and humiliated by this that he decided to fast until death. And at that time, it's described some of the denizens in the demoniac worlds, in the netherworlds, they became disturbed because they had plans that involved Duryodhana. So they sent a demoness after him named Kritya, and she hypnotized him, and she brought him down to this subterranean world where these demons were assembled. and she turned him over to them. And they told him, these were the Danavas, it's a class of Asura, that his presence on earth, his birth, had been arranged in advance and that it was planned by them. And he explained they explained to Duryodhana that his great strength and his immunity to weapons were also part of their manipulations, and that he shouldn't spoil their plans by fasting until death. They explained to him that some of their members, the Danavas and the Daityas, these are class of Asuras, the bad guys, that they would take birth on the surface of the earth, that they had taken birth in the warrior caste, and that they would help him in his battle against Arjuna and Arjuna's brother. They also explained that they would possess some of the principal warriors on the surface of the earth, that they would overcome their souls, and that they would make them very furious, and that they would guide them in their fight against Arjuna and his brothers. So they told him that they were going to perpetrate a holocaust, and they were going to annihilate Arjuna and all of his allies. He was taken back to the surface of the earth. He was made to forget the experience. He just vaguely remembered it and thought it was a dream, but he was left with new hope, and he was left with this idea in his mind that he was going to engage in combat against the Arjuna and his brothers, and he was going to kill them. So here we have an example that's very interesting, an example of underground manipulation of the surface world. And I think that if there's anything that people should be aware about, if there's any connections that they should make, or any conclusions that they should arrive at, it's this idea that these underground worlds are there, these cavern worlds are there, and these materialistic beings are there, but that they engage in manipulation of the surface world. They take birth as humans, they walk on the surface of the earth as shapeshifters, they influence people's souls and minds, they take possession of people and influence people's thinking, and they have agendas for the surface of the earth. And this has been going on for many thousands of years. I mean, this happened 5,000 years ago while the Krishna avatar supposedly was on the planet. So what to speak of now that we're in a very materialistic age? I think that we have to interpret political events and military events on the surface of the planet. We have to interpret power blocks and war and threats of war between the Chinese and the communists and the capitalists. I think we have to try to interpret these in terms of manipulation by these different living entities, these different races and clans of materialistic living entities that live below the surface of the earth. And this one story about the abduction of Duryodhana is, I think, a very good example. It's very typical.
Well, what I think is interesting is, the use of the word abduction, and a little bit that you shared, and I'm going to have to go back and research that story because now you got my little ears perking. What I think is interesting is that he was hypnotized, and when this whole thing transpires, at the end, he thinks he has a dream. And when you look at both biblical stories, where Jacob thinks he's having a dream, Enoch having a dream, all these people are having a dream, or modern abduction stories where, the person is paralyzed. You hear these stories of body sensations and then they don't remember on the other side, or they think they're having a dream. I mean, it sounds very... what we're realizing now, kind of common to the abduction experience.
Sure, and these are the same living entities, and even their craft, the UFO craft, are described in the Puranic literature with the same flight characteristics. Now they appear, and then now they're there, and then a minute later they're not there. Like they're on the radar, and then they're not the radar. And they travel at some unimaginable speed, and all of a sudden they stop in short, and no aircraft can do that, or they make a right angle turn at speeds that we can't even imagine. This type of flight characteristic, even the motherships that we've heard described. For example, Travis Walton, he described a type of mothership, an aircraft carrier or a flying city. These types of accounts are all there in the Puranic literature. So, yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
I mean, one of the things about reading through the Puranic literature is that, one, there's just so much. And they constantly are throwing out these names of people like you know who they are or what they do or how they fit in. I mean, it's just, you have to sit there, with Wikipedia open. It's like, okay, what is that? Okay, what is that? I mean, there's definitely research that you have to do to understand the impact. You were talking about, I don't know, the little fairy beings or these people, but if you don't realize that when they say this word, it's not like they came from France, it's, they're of this alien heritage, which really changes the story a lot.
Yeah. The Vedic literature, it really is vast. I can imagine a person who just cracks a book and wants to read a Purana. I mean, I think the familiarity with the few Puranas that I have, it's something that I acquired gradually over a few years of reading. One interesting book in this regard would actually be Alien Identities, and that's where you can read about this abduction account involving Duryodhana. Are you familiar with Alien Identities?
No, I've never heard that one.
Well, you're familiar with Forbidden Archaeology, I imagine.
Yes, we've had Michael on several times, and actually he's coming back on in a few weeks. Yeah.
Well, the co-author to that book was Richard Thompson. And Dr. Thompson, he wrote his own book called Alien Identities. And in this book, to me it's similar to the Michael Mott book. What he did was he took all of these accounts of demoniac beings and materialistic beings that you find in UFO type of beings in the Vedic literature, the Puranic literature, and he related them to Western folklore, the leprechauns and the trolls and fairies and those types of beings. And he did just a great job of them. He related the descriptions of the flying cities that are there in the Puranas with some of these other UFO accounts. So that one, it breaks it down for you. He does all the work for you, and he explains it for the Western reader. He does a very good job of that. It's called Alien Identities, and the book is still out there. It's available.
All right, making a little note on my paper.
Okay. But really, I'm amazed at the way this story by this abduction account by Duryodhana just shows so well how these living entities that live beneath the surface of the earth engage in manipulation. What goes on the surface. I think that Whitley Strieber, he also had some experience like that. He was given some agendas, some writing to do, something like that. They don't abduct people that wash dishes in restaurants. They always abduct people who have some type of influence.
Well, I don't know about that part, or maybe they don't realize they have a certain something going on, at the time that they have been abducted, that might end up coming out because of their experience or whatever. I have a good friend of mine, Tom Reed, who his family has been a family of abductees. He was abducted, his mother was abducted, his brother was abducted, and that's as far back as they can go historically. But if you meet the guy, he's just this regular guy who's had this really bizarre experience, and his brother has had similar bizarre experiences. You know what I mean? And so, it's not like, Well, no, ooh, nope. You know what? Cancel that. His dad was a politician. I think he was like a state. He was a state senator or something like that. Okay, cancel that. But he's very unassuming in personality by himself. But anyway, but because of their experiences, they have really been moving forward and getting their story out. If they didn't have this experience, then they probably wouldn't have done anything, and he would just be some regular guy.
Right. Well, there do seem to be several motives actually for abduction, and one of them seems to be a sexual motive. That's there in the European accounts, the medieval accounts, the trolls that abduct the beautiful young maiden, that kind of thing. It's also there in the Puranic literature. In my book, I have this chapter on Prince Ritudhvaj. It's from the Dattatreya Purana. But his wife was abducted by a shape-shifting demon who appeared as a humble mendicant, a Brahmin, a humble monk, something like that, and he sent the prince off in one direction because he told about the demons, and they did this and they did that, and then when the prince went off, he abducted his wife and took her down to his underground world and insisted that she marry him. But Ritudhvaj, he was a very specific human being. He's an empowered human being, and he went after her. He took his horse and he followed this demon down to his world. The demon's house is described. His palace, his underground palace, is described. The servants there are described. It was all very opulent and shining and beautiful. And this Ritudhvaj, he fought the demon, and he was able to capture her and bring her back. He did this with the help of some Nagas, actually. The Nagas, they have a fame of being not so inimical towards the human beings. They've actually done a lot of favors, and they've been favorable towards human beings also. But there's that story also. That was simply an example of pure sexual abduction on the part of the demon, kidnap the man's wife because she's very beautiful and take her away.
But you hear stories like that in other mythology, like Zeus changing his shape and having sex with women, and with the production of demigods on the other end.
Yeah. I mean, the human beings, we seem to be the playthings of the gods and the playthings of the demons. And they both appear on human society. If you read the Bhagavad Purana, if you read the story of the Krishna avatar, the demigods gathered with Brahma. Brahma is the chief of the demigods. He's the original. He's the creator of this universe. They gathered together at the shore of the Garbhodak Ocean, and Brahma entered into contact through some type of mental telepathy with Vishnu, whose abode is in the middle of this ocean, and he expressed that the earth was being overburdened by demons who had taken birth in the kingly order, along the lines that we just described. These demons told Duryodhana that we're already there, we have other warriors that are we've taken birth as warriors, we're already there. So the Vishnu communicated to Brahma that the demigods should take birth also in the dynasty of Vrishni and in the Yadu dynasty, and that he would incarnate and he would help the Yadu dynasty. This was the dynasty of Arjuna and his brothers, to rid the face of the earth of these demoniac kings. So they all took birth on the earth also. So in this huge army, you had Arjuna's army on one side. There were all of these demigods that had taken birth as human, and on the other side, you had all of these demons who had incarnated as human kings. In fact, Arjuna was the son of Indra, who is one of the big commanders of the demigods. His brother Bhima was the son of Pavana, who is the wind god, and his oldest brother, the rightful emperor, was Yudhishthir. He was actually a direct incarnation of Yama, who is the demigod that determines our next birth according to our karmic activities in this birth. So even their birth, the birth of Arjuna and his brothers, was a very privileged birth. So the demigods do this, and the materialistic living entities, they also take birth on the earth, and they both they compete with each other and try to establish supremacy on the earth, something like that.
Well, I am looking at the times. Let's see, Supreme. If I could write at all, it would be so much better. Why don't we take a break here, because I want to come back to that whole concept of power, control, supremacy, because I think that's a really interesting, because it was going on in the myths, and it seems like it's still going on now. And I'd like to explore that a little more, but we have less than a minute before the commercial time, so I think we'll just move the commercials up a little bit and come back and go into that topic. Sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. So before the break, I wanted to talk a little bit about this, battle that's going on between the Devas and the Asuras. It always makes me confused, because it just seems like Devas should be the bad guy and Asuras should be the good guys, because we think like angels and demons, and it always gets me a little backwards, but it's the other way. My question is, how did they, if there's this battle going on, who's winning the battle? It just seems like the Asuras just really have a bad rap in this whole thing. And, I have this thing about, channeled information. It's like, well, who's providing the information? They say that the history of war is told by the victors. And when you read some of this Vedic material, it definitely seems like Indira and the Devas won the war. And so are positioned toward the Asuras as being manipulators and controllers based on fact, or is it based on that's the propaganda that we've received from the Devas? Any comment on that thought?
Well, let's see. I'll make two observations. One observation is that the Deva civilization is oriented towards God realization. It's oriented towards, in fact, I'll make two comments in one. God realization towards vegetarianism, towards the worship of Vishnu, the worship of the demigods, leaving the material world, leaving your body behind, attaining mukta and liberation from repeated birth and death and reincarnation and karma, gaining liberation from this material world. And the Asura civilization doesn't have that orientation, doesn't have that kind of literature, doesn't have that practice. They're much more expert at enjoying the world than the Deva civilization. So I think that's the basic difference between the two of them. I'll say that. Okay.
Well, because I did have kind of a point of going there. So do you think that...
No, I think that was a very good, it was a good question. I think it was.
See, I told you I have good questions. But do you think there's a relationship between this dynamic of these Devas that live in the sky and these Asuras that live underground and our current concept of hell? Or Western concept of hell?
Yes, no, I definitely think they do. I think that the Gandharvas, who live in this higher frequency, ultraviolet frequency strata above the clouds, as it's been described, are the ones that are described in the the Bible as the angels, and also in the Quran as the angels, and that these ones that live below the surface of the earth, that they are the asuras, and that they will torment human beings if we wander into the wrong neighborhood. Let's put it that way, or if they come topside, and get a hold of us.
Yeah, it's just kind of a scary thought that there's this whole race of being, or potentially, I mean, if you read the Vedic material, potentially multiple races of beings that are just hanging out under our feet.
Yeah, it is scary, but if you were to go to any big city, for example, New York City, and you were to lift up some construction, a house or something like that, some row houses, and look to see what's underneath the foundations, you'll find all kinds of insects, cockroaches, snakes, those types of beings. And then if you actually look at the way that these UFO beings have been described, these beings that scare us so much and horrify us so much, and if you look at their faces, that we've seen in the drawings, you see that they have slit-like mouths, just like spiders. They have the digital dexterity of spiders. They're very fast. Their eyes are like insect eyes. They have these wraparound fly-like eyes. They're very scary, and actually, but that's what we see when we start digging beneath the ground. We come across these types of living entities, cockroaches and different types of insects. It's just that maybe 100 miles down or way down in the depths of the earth, perhaps conditions are different. The climate is more salubrious, and perhaps they grow to great proportions. And what we see as an insect on the surface of the earth might be a mothman down within the bowels of the crust, of the earth's crust. You look at an oak tree. An oak tree in its own environment is very tall. It's very strong. It's a hardwood. You can't budge it. But then you look at the oak tree in the Arctic shores of northern Canada, and it hardly grows any higher than your knees or maybe your belt. And it just looks like a little bush or something like that. It's out of its climate. So I think that when we scratch the surface of the earth, when we start running into these different insects in the ground and underneath buildings, I think we get an idea of what really exists further down, maybe a few 100 miles down. It's just they filtered up a little bit and they're out of their environment. These humanoids, they're like insect men, like the praying mantis. They even describe them that way. Travis Walton, he described the praying mantis type UFO entity.
So do you don't think the Nagas, for lack of a better word, and I don't like associating this word with them, but the reptilians are still down there as well? In the seventh level of the earth?
I imagine that they are still down there. I don't imagine that they've been annihilated in their worlds. I think that there has been combat below the surface of the earth. There has even been some combat and annihilation that we have seen, but we haven't been able to interpret it that way. For example, think about the underground nuclear testing that went on in Nevada and in Area 51. Now, that nuclear testing took place very close to the area that the Apaches considered their homeland, their central location. They always fought the U.S. cavalry with guerrilla tactics, and they would run away. Specifically, they would disappear through the caves and turn up somewhere else a few days later, say 20 miles away. But the one place where they stopped and made a stand and fought a pitched battle against the U.S. Army was just about 20 miles away from where some of these underground detonations took place. So are these the worlds of the Apaches? Were they defending their underworld? Were they defending their homeland, their cavern world homeland? These explosions that took place in Nevada, in Area 51, was the purpose of these explosions to implode the cavern worlds, to destroy their cities, their civilization.
Interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. What's really going on?
Well,
what's really going on?
Knows. I mean, because I was just watching a show this week. It was definitely this week, in the last day or two, talking about Area 51. Oh, it was, God. I can't think of it. Yeah, but anyway, so they were talking about Area 51, and one of the comments that they made was that, and I kind of took it to the next level, was that Area 51 was built on an abandoned silver mine. It's like, and they dug the silver out of there because there were already these tunnels down there that they found veins of silver. Anyway, and now you're bringing up Area 51 and that whole thing, and it just, makes you go, You start looking at this stuff, and it just makes you go, a lot.
Yeah. That is the area in which the Apaches used to disappear through these caves and these tunnels, and like I say, they would pop up somewhere else many miles away. Also, I mean, we're talking about out west. Let's expand the region a little bit, but let's look at the Panamint Mountains. I believe they're also in Nevada. But the Panamints, there's in this book Death Valley Men, or Death Valley Days. I don't remember the exact name of it, but there's this one chapter of these two fellas who were prospecting, and alongside of a mountain, they saw an opening behind some bushes. And they went in there, and they found steps, and they went down, down, down. They went very far down, and they found a huge hall down there, a huge type of cavern carved out, and there was furniture down there, and there was a lot of metal work and silver there, and they saw spears. They saw some huge, some huge shields. So, I mean, there's these underground worlds. They are there. They're out there, and they're everywhere. Everybody thinks that, in Brazil, in the Andes Mountains, there's a tunnel system that Von Daniken tells about that goes underneath the Pacific Ocean and that kind of thing. But really, I get the feeling that these underground worlds exist everywhere. For example, all across North America, all of the North American Indians, their folklore has to do with them coming from the interior of the earth, the Cherokee. The term Cherokee means the cave people, and they were from the East Coast, the Appalachians. And when you start looking around you, the Tibetans, and then there's the British Isles and the trolls in Europe, and the world is full of these underground entities and these cave worlds, these cavern worlds that they must live in. I get the feeling that they're everywhere.
One of the things that I find interesting when you look at the mythological literature, just in the general sense of the word, is that these beings, for lack of a better word, are always associated with the mountain. It's like you're going to go to the mountain, or like the Epic of Gilgamesh, he is looking for Armasupal. I can never say any of these people's names, but the Babylonian Noah, who is in the underworld, living out immortality, and he has to go to the mountain. And what I think is kind of parallel interesting is that when you start looking at these pyramid structures, aka little mountains, in my mind, they all have tunnels, underground tunnels under them.
Sure. I get the impression that the pyramids are also outposts, that they're markers, that below the pyramids you have these cavern worlds. Just look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The Egyptian Book of the Dead speaks of these paradise worlds below Egypt. And, we've heard of tunnel systems existing below the pyramids. There's certainly a secrecy surrounding the discoveries that they've made, not only of the pyramids, but even graves and all the discoveries in Egypt, they're all shrouded with so much mystery and secrecy. I just get the idea that there's something down there that they don't want to tell people about, you know?
You think?
Yeah. Well, you know, and it's also interesting, nobody's allowed to engage in caving or in spelunking. There's all kinds of legislation against it now. You have to have permission. In Brazil, no caving and no spelunking is permitted at all. It's against the law, and it's federal law, and there's a federal agency. It's the agency of mining and extractive industries that has jurisdiction over that. But I don't know. It's very interesting. Down here we have, not too far away from where I live, this tunnel that David Hatcher Childress has written so much about. It's the one at São Tomé das Letras. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
Probably. What have they found in it, or what?
Well, São Tomé das Letras is a small city way out in the countryside. Let's say behind Rio de Janeiro, you know, like a few hundred miles back. And it's an area of quarries. I could tell you that much. This tunnel that they found in São Tomé das Letras, it's not a cave. It doesn't meander. It's been cut. It's about 2 meters high and about 3 meters wide. And it has a grade to it. It goes gradually, you know, it has a decline. It goes on a gradual decline. And it goes on for miles and miles and miles and miles, as straight as can be, due west. Now, the Brazilian army, they had a team of cavers that penetrated this tunnel. And as I say, it's a tunnel. It's not a cave. Several days journey, many miles, they went in until they came to a type of hall, and this hall had 4 tunnels meeting. It was like a hub. It had another tunnel continuing west, the tunnel they came from, which was from the east, one north and one south. They took the tunnel west a little bit for about another day until they came to this huge chasm that they didn't have the ability to cross. Their supplies were limited, so they decided to come back. And ever since then, it's been prohibited for anyone to go down that cave. And, of course, it's impossible. How can somebody do that? You'd need all kinds of supplies, and you'd have to take batteries with you and food and have replenishment and water.
You know, but then it gets more interesting. I mean, because it sounds like this was a man-made structure, and for early man with his little sticks and stone tools to carve something like that in the pitch black and create this engineering feat, and probably if they looked at the surface of the, you know, like the ceilings and stuff, there's probably not any like oil residue from lights, you know, from oil lamps or fires inside these structures. And it's a miracle, Dean. It's just a miracle that it could just happen naturally and just be there. Just boom.
Yeah, it certainly is. And how about these caverns in Peru, in the Andes? They do actually go underneath the Pacific Ocean for at least a good 5 miles. Daniken, he's been able to substantiate that. I mean, this is before the Spaniards went there, but neither the Spaniards nor the Indians had any ability to engage in that kind of excavation. I don't know what to say. When the Portuguese came here to Brazil, there were a lot of constructions here also, not just in Peru, but there were constructions here. There were temples here. Even in Rio de Janeiro, that big Pedro da Gávea, everyone says that it's a sculpture of a human face. If you look at it from the side, you can see the profile. It has eyes. The eyes are twin openings to a cave. There's a cave behind it, and it also goes on and on and on. I don't know what to say. The Portuguese that came here, especially the Jesuits, they knocked down all these temples that they found and all these constructions that they found, and they used the the rocks to build some of their churches. How about that?
But it's the same story everywhere in South America. It's just sad, Mexico, South America. It's just sad, But anyway, let's move along from my disappointment in losing so much material. I mean, it's right up there with losing the Library of Alexandria. Was it something that was supposed, was it an accident, or do we yet have another conspiracy theory thing going on? Did somebody intentionally set it on fire so that we would lose knowledge to all kinds of information?
Well, there were mounds all across North America that the pioneers came across in their covered wagons, and they did a little bit of digging, excavating. They came up with all kinds of artifacts, and it was typical for them at that time to send them to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. And we never saw hide nor hair. We've read about some of the things that were sent, but we don't, lamps and things like that, metalworking, but none of it's available. There's no record of it.
It's
so we
all
have
in
lost
Warehouse
a lot of material.
13.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Why don't we go back and, because we've been talking about these subterranean chambers, but it sounds like there is really a whole different set of mythology and information that is associated with the hollow earth. And, in my mind, I just kind of put it all together, but it sounds like we're really obviously we're talking about two different things. So in the Vedic literature, does it talk about, an empty, hollow earth?
Well, it certainly is two different phenomena. It's a matter of two different phenomena. The hollow earth is described in the Vedic literature. It's mentioned in the literature, I would say just in passing. Just like you might talk about, for example, you might read about the American Revolution, and you would hear England mentioned, and you would hear France mentioned. And everybody already knows that these are regions that exist on the other side of the ocean. It's not explained, and there is this ocean, and there's so many miles wide, and there you will find the land of France and the land. It wasn't explained that way. Everybody already knew about them. It was the same civilization. It's just that it existed at another, across a distance, and then the same civilization picked up again. So the Vedic civilization, some of the narrations that take place in the hollow earth, and some of them that take place on the surface. For example, we were talking about the Bhagavad Gita, and we mentioned Arjuna, and we mentioned his brother Yudhishthir. Now, Yudhishthir and Krishna, they were having a conversation a little bit before the battle that is described in the Bhagavad Gita, and the Krishna avatar mentioned to Yudhishthir that this earthly king named Jarasandha, who was a close ally to Duryodhana, the cousin who had become their enemy and usurped their kingdom, that this Jarasandha, he had made alliances with all of the kings from the inner world. So, right there it's just mentioned in passing, that the inner world kings, they've allied themselves with the other side, the Krishna avatar was trying to just talking with our Yudhishthira and let him know what he was really up against. But then they were mentioned. And
you don't think there's really they were really talking about the subterranean realms as opposed to the inner world?
Well, for one thing, we're depending on translators because this is all written in Sanskrit, and it was conserved for over a few thousand years, handed down by hand. But the folklore is there, the collective memory is there. For example, in the Tibetans, they speak of Shambhala being in the hollow earth, and there are other narrations which are more specific rather than just this casual conversation between the Krishna avatar and Arjuna's brother. So I think that the hollow cavity was being referred to. A very symbolic narration story was the one of the sons of Sagara. You know, the Puranas can actually be likened to the Old Testament a little bit in the Bible, in the sense that you have the story of all of these old heroes and their activities and what it was that they did. And some of them are very famous, just like some of the biblical accounts are very famous. You know, everybody's heard about David and Goliath, for example. There are others that are just very well known. So amongst the Hindus, it's like that too. They have some of these Puranic narrations that are very popular and they're very well known. And one of them is that of the sons of Sagara. Sagara was an earthly king, and he had engaged in a lot of austerity and a lot of sacrifice, and he had acquired a lot of mystic potencies and powers. He was becoming very powerful, and he was beginning to scare the king of heaven, at least of one of the heavenly realms, and this was Indra. So Sagara was about to perform some great sacrifice in which a sacrificial horse would pass through the fire and he wouldn't get burned. And this was supposed to, I don't know, through this sacrifice, through this fire ceremony, he would acquire some additional mystic powers, something like that. So the king of heaven, Indra, he turned into a horse thief and he robbed the horse. He robbed the sacrificial horse and he hid the horse. So this king Sagara, he sent his sons, he had 100 sons, he sent them to roam around the entire face of the earth, searching everywhere for the sacrificial horse. And of course they couldn't find it. So then he told them to go to the hollow portion of the earth and search there too. And there's a description that they went to the northern ocean. This would be the Arctic Ocean. I don't know of any other. And that they descended through an opening in the earth into the hollow portion. And the word used is madhya, which means the middle portion. It mentions for some reason that they descended into that hollow world with great delight. Now Indra had hidden the horse in the hermitage of one of the famous Vedic rishis, Kapila. Kapila Rishi, he had a hermitage in the hollow earth. And this horse was nearby while he was meditating. This horse was grazing. And the sons of Sagara came upon Kapila, and they gave him a hard time, accused him of stealing the horse, and he explained that it wasn't him, that it was just there. And of course, this history goes on and on. But the point is that they were on the surface of the earth. They conducted a search on the surface of the earth, and the description is that they went into the hollow part of the earth, specifically through this opening that we feel exists in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, and that they walked around on the inner surface then, and they had interaction with this being who was Kapila Rishi. And, you know, you even get specific information like that. Beings are mentioned, human beings are mentioned that lived there, their activities, you know, what they were doing. He was a rishi, and he was meditating. The city of Shambhala is there. That city is mentioned. And there's an interesting, how would you say, an interesting anecdote in relation to the city of Shambhala. If you don't mind, I could pass that along too.
Sure.
Well, I'll tell you, when I was very young, right now I'm 56 years old, but when I was about 12 or 13 living in the city of Washington, I used to go downtown to DuPont Circle with my sister. She was a lot older than me, and she would go to this Maharishi meditation place, and she got me involved in meditation and that kind of thing. And there were a group of them that would go to the Indian Embassy, because there was an Indian Embassy reading room, and you could read the Upanishads and Vivekananda and you know, all these different Shivananda, all these different meditation guys, and all of the Puranas were there too. So I remember we were reading about the city of Shambhala, that at the end of the Kali Yuga, the Kalki avatar will be born in the city of Shambhala, in a Brahmin family. He will be born into the Brahmin caste, and that he will ride this beautiful white horse to the surface of the earth, and he will, this is at the end of Kali Yuga, he will bring men with him from the interior, and they will repopulate the surface of the earth, and the earth will become green again, and this will usher in the next cycle of yugas. This will bring in the Sattva Yuga, the Yuga of truth. The same literature also describes that by the end of the Kali Yuga, the surface of the earth is barren, it's desolate, it's dry, it's a desert. Human beings will be 3 feet tall. A man who lives to be 7 years will have a good lifespan, and the human beings will run in packs, and they will communicate with each other through grunts. So I always wondered, how can this be that you have this avatar who appears in a family of Brahmins, who rides this shining white steed, this beautiful horse, and this beautiful city which is full of palaces and parks and tanks of water, and it's at the end of the Kali Yuga, and the earth is supposed to be desolate like that. That never made sense to me, and it always bothered me, But then when I came across the hollow earth theory, I realized that Shambhala is considered to be a hollow earth city, a city in the interior of the earth. That's how the Tibetans describe it. They're very aware of the hollow earth theory in Tibet. The Hindus are not so much, but the Tibetans, they were very conscious of this idea.
Well, and I'm just glad that, the Kali Yuga isn't ending December 21st, 2012, as some people would like us to believe. We got plenty of time. All right, we have definitely time for a few more incarnations before we're only 3 feet tall. There was a question in the chat room, which I think is a great question, and it's from Jim Barnard, and it says, if there's an entrance to hollow earth in the Arctic, what keeps the oceans on the surface from running down the hole? And then, let's see, all the maps put the hole out in the deep Arctic. I don't know if that helps at all.
Well, okay. First of all, I think that this reader wants to get a concept of gravity. A simple concept of gravity is that gravity exists on the surface, and it pulls us towards the surface, pulls our feet towards the surface of the planet. But then there's also a surface as you go into the hole, as you go into the opening, and there's also a surface which is the inner surface. There's gravity along the inner surface, and there's gravity along the sides, and as you gradually come out along the outer surface. There's oceans in the inner world as well. So the reason the water doesn't go gliding in is that it's not that there's this point in the center of the sphere, which is the central point of attraction of gravity, and that all of the water is going to pour through this hole and head towards the center of this hollow cavity. There's an inner surface also, and there's already water there. If there were no water there, then the water from the surface would flow inwards until there was equilibrium between the inside and the outside. But there's water there, and they have gravity there, and they have oceans there.
See, what I just keep wondering is how you actually, is it just this big giant hole? And, I'm just trying to think of a parallel example, like a soda bottle, a big round soda bottle, where there's the hole where you screw the top on, and you go up to the Arctic, and you get to that hole, and you just fall in till you end up in the middle. I mean, I that's why I thought the question was interesting, because there's a whole lot of dynamics that are going on that if you just think there's a big hole in the surface of the earth and then, you just kind of plop down to the middle, it kind of makes you have to think, how would that all work?
Well, you want to conceive of the opening as being an hourglass opening. That's what we call it. We call it the hourglass opening. So you have a grade along the outside that gradually curves inwards, and then you have a point where you have the neck of the opening, just like you have the neck of the hourglass, and then as you go in again, it begins to expand outwards along the inner surface. So first of all, the shape of that opening, you could conceive of it better as being an hourglass. And to give you an idea of the angle, the steepness, or rather, the lack of steepness of this opening, at least in the beginning, let me run by you some of the writings from the logbooks of the Arctic explorers. We have Admiral Macmillan, who was active around the turn of the century, say 110 years ago, and this was at Ellesmere Island in northern Canada, right where Canada touches or almost touches Greenland. And he took off across, with his expedition, they took off across the Arctic ice in the northern direction. They were looking for a land mass. But what he noted, this was even while he was still on the continental North America, Canada, before he actually took off on the ice. But what he noted was the phenomena that we call foreshortening of the horizon. In other words, the horizon would drop off quickly, sooner than it usually does. I mean, if you go to Oklahoma or northern Texas and you look around, you can see the full extent of the horizon. I mean, where the horizon curves every 9 miles. So where you see the end of the horizon, that's 9 miles away from you, and it looks like it's very far away. But what they were experiencing, they gave one example in their writings, is that on the horizon they could see a mountain or a hill shooting up, and they could see the top of it, but they couldn't see the base of it because it was below the horizon still. So they would walk towards it, and before 9 miles, they described they would very quickly arrive at this mountain, at this hill that they had been looking at with their binoculars. And they were thinking, well, that wasn't 9 miles. We've gotten here very quickly. And they were a little bit perplexed by this because there seemed to be foreshortening. The horizon was dropping off quickly. And that's because not only is the Earth flat on top, it's not like an egg put on its side. The curvature does change and it does flatten. But then the Arctic, at least the eastern part where Greenland is, the Arctic Ocean is like a huge basin with a very gradual slope to it. So as they would trudge forward, they noticed this, that they would come upon objects that were on the horizon very quickly. And we attribute this to the flattening out and actually to the inward sloping of the opening. But then, of course, this puts them about 700 miles away from what we call the North Pole. Now, Peary was the discoverer of the North Pole. And Dr. Cook, before him, claimed to be the discoverer, but they didn't want to give it to him because of some of his exaggerated and what they interpreted as eccentric comments in his logbook. Of course, Peary's comments were worse, but by that time they just they threw in the towel, and they awarded the distinction of having discovered the pole to Peary. This is what Peary noticed. As he was approaching the pole, all of a sudden his speeds, according to his celestial navigation, increased very much. Actually, this was on his way back from the pole. He had clear skies, and what he calculated was that in a 48-hour period, and this was stopping to rest and sleep a little bit along the way, that he traveled something like 140-some miles. I think it was about 73 miles per day, 140 miles in a 48-hour period over the Arctic ice. This, of course, is impossible. He attributed this maybe, he couldn't explain it either, but he was very honest. He wrote what he experienced, what he calculated. He felt that because he had already blazed a trail on his way to the pole, on the way back that their speed was maybe a little bit faster, and also the wind was behind him. Dr. Cook had a similar experience. He was traveling something like 40 miles a day as he approached the pole. What's really happening? What's really happening is that the slope is not gradual anymore. As you get close to the neck of the hourglass opening, it becomes rather steep, and your movements in relation to the stars in the sky become exaggerated in the way that an usher in a movie theater might turn on his flashlight and he might flick it from one side of the dark auditorium to the other. Well, actually, what he moved was a very short distance, but projected against the sky, because the slope was actually sharper, and it was an inward slope. It wasn't an outer curve like they were thinking, because, of course, on the surface of the Earth we have an outer curve. Nobody is anticipating that they're actually entering into a basin and that the curve is becoming, very sharp all of a sudden. So as he approached the opening, the curvature became very sharp, and both he and before him Dr. Cook reported these exaggerated movements in relation to the background of the sky, the stars that they were using to calculate and navigate their positions. But this gives you an idea of what the opening is like then. By northern Canada, you're 700 miles away. The slope is very gradual, but you notice an inward slope because there's foreshortening. You come upon the horizon very quickly. When you get close to that hourglass opening, then your travel becomes very quick, and you think that you've traveled many, many miles, but that's because of the curvature, the inward slope, not that you actually traveled that distance. I don't know. Is this understandable? Does this make sense to you?
I mean, it does in one way, but it's a little hard to believe. Although, then I think of Santa, and maybe that's how he delivers all those presents so quick every year.
Well, yeah. How about speaking of Santa, Santa is a Scandinavian myth, that this mystic would come from the north on a sleigh, which apparently had some anti-gravity qualities to it, pulled by these reindeer, and he would bring presents, and he would bring supplies and food and tools and things like that to these Scandinavians, the Vikings, who suffered very much because of the cold and the ice. They couldn't find food. So, I wonder where he was coming from. If he came from the north and he had all these mystic qualities, he was probably coming from the Hollow Earth. These were holy people that came to Northern Europe to help the people there.
Interesting. I was just throwing out the Santa joke, but you just waylaid it into a home run there.
Yeah.
All right, I'm looking at the clock. We have about 12 minutes. I have one more question because I wanted to spend a couple of minutes. You're in Brazil, right? This isn't the question, but I'm just kind of leading into anyway, but I want to spend time. You're in Brazil, and I've heard that there's been a lot of UFO activity going on there, so don't answer that yet because I want to close with that. But here's my last question before we move on to that topic. So would these beings be considered ETs, or would they be considered Earth beings that we don't know about? Because it sounds like they've been here as long, if not longer than, and I'm going to put this in quotes, mankind.
Well, if you're going to take any stock, for example, in Olaf Janssen said they're just like us. They're identical to us. The characteristics, the race, they're our same race. And of course, if you think about it, Scandinavia is only maybe a good 700 miles from the opening. So probably the population of Northern Europe is some kind of spillage that comes from the Hollow Earth. These are the same people. They're human beings. They're described in the Vedic literature as human beings. Some of the Vedic kings and the Vedic population existed within the earth and some on the outside of the earth. Certainly, Vedic culture existed along the Arctic. There's been all kinds of artifacts recovered. The population is there. They speak Indo-European language. It's just corrupted Sanskrit. There was even one very famous Hindu, Tilak was his name. He was part of the Patriot independence movement before Gandhi. He was its leader, and when he passed away, Gandhi stepped into the void. But this Tilak, he wrote in the 1920s while he was in jail, because the British put him there, he wrote the Arctic Home of the Vedas, and he explained that Vedic culture had its origin along the Arctic shores, and that the Arctic used to be tropical. He thought it was because of pole shifts and that kind of thing. But the hollow earth theory, of course, gives us a different justification. So those people that are inside, they're human beings, and they're very similar to the Northern Europeans. The racial stock is the same, and they speak a language which is very similar to Sanskrit. This was Olaf's claim.
But what about the people in the subterranean realms? The giants and the Bigfoots and the Nagas and whoever else might be hanging out down there?
Well, when you speak of the hollow earth, you're speaking of one realm. You're speaking of one world. And then when you speak of the cavern worlds, you're speaking of many different pockets. And the idea that I have is that you have all kinds of living entities down there. And also it might depend on the depth, the strata. But certainly the Bigfoot, the Almas of Central Asia that were encountered by that Russian division that got involved in combat and pulled one of these entities out of the cave, they are one of the types of living entities that live down there. The leprechauns are another one. The elves are another one. There are different types of living entities that live in all of these different pockets that we call cavern worlds.
Anyway, let's move on. So, what's going on in Brazil? You know, I just want to spend a couple of minutes kind of talking about some of the UFO activity that's been going on down there, because one, it seems like the news is able to talk about it, unlike here, but there also sounds like there's a lot of activity going on down there. And since you're there and can do like some first-hand reporting, what's going on?
Well, I've been visiting on and off one of these UFO societies for the last couple of years, and just hearing the things that they tell me. Really, I would say it's in the past, in the recent past, it's been much more obvious. There's been a lot more encounters, a lot more reports. That's for sure. I don't really know how to explain why, you know. A lot of this was people out in the country. There have been a lot of encounters from these country folk, simple people that live on big plantations and what have you. And these are areas where even 25, 30 years ago, there were no telephone lines, and maybe there was no electricity except if there was a generator on the property, something like that. But one thing that I was very amazed by was, I found this in this book by Antonio Falero, UFOs in Brazil. He's been documenting and interviewing people who have had encounters since the early 1960s, because in his city, it was, let's say, a hotbed of UFO sightings. He's from a small town right in the middle of Brazil. But he has a section in his books about balls of light, and it's amazing what people say. These balls of light, they're also called Foo Fighters. You might have heard that term used. Yeah, he says he has all these interviews, people saying that they come out of the mountains, they come out of the mountain tops, out of the peaks or hilltops, and that they come down the side of the mountains, and they go about their activity. They seem to be monitoring. They enter homes. They will enter a home through an open door, or they'll go through a window, or even if everything is closed, then they'll pass right through the wall. Once inside, they'll go from one room to another as if they're monitoring. The people will be scared. If anybody tries to grab at them, they'll quickly move away as if they're sensitive and they perceive the people. And when they finish their observation, their reconnoitering, they'll leave the home again and they'll go off in the woods and go along their merry way. But then what's interesting is that it's very typical for these balls of lights, when they finish their activity, they end up in a creek bed and they sink into the water, and there's all kinds of bubbling activity and sand is thrown up all over the place, and then they disappear through the creek bed without a trace really, and everything just returns to normal. So this is underground origins of UFOs again, because balls of light are a type of UFO. But here in Brazil, at least, I've run across quite a few interviews, accounts in his books, of people swearing to this underground origin, that they come from the mountaintops and that they typically disappear into creeks.
And it sounds like these things are actually pretty small. I mean, I always had the impression that those balls of light were large. You know, house size. I don't know. I mean, you know, you just kind of make up the size, but if they're going in through a window, then proportionally speaking, you know, they maybe are the size of a basketball versus ginormous of what you would think they would be.
Yeah, in Antonio's book, he compares them to the size of soccer balls, basketballs. That's right. They're not so big. There was one account of a ball of light that was in a cage, that was like a bird cage, only it was a little bit more rectangular. And it was about 2 meters off the surface. And, you know, it just went along its merry way through a path in the woods. Some fellow was coming home from a party or some midnight drinking or something like that on his way home, and he came upon this ball of light, followed it a little bit.
That's kind of interesting. I mean, they say that those balls of light, you know, are often seen with crop circle formation too.
Okay, I haven't seen that. One thing I mean, what I've just mentioned is a first. First of all, this underground connection, they disappear into creek beds. But another thing I heard down here about balls of lights, and there's this, it's very well documented. There's a neighborhood not far from where I live. It's called Capão Redondo. And in this neighborhood, about 8 years ago, there was this young fellow who received a camcorder as a present for his birthday, and the family went up to the top of the building, and they were on top there taking, filming this and that and the other in the early evening while people were still walking on the streets and there were street lights on and some stores were still open. I mean, this was no middle of the night activity or that happened, event. And they noticed this ball of light come skipping down the road. This is in the city, in the urban setting, in the neighborhood. And they filmed it for about 3 or 4 minutes. It came down one road. They've actually put it on the internet. And it went up another road. It passed in front of, as well as some light posts, and it passed behind some other ones. So it didn't seem to be an artifact of, manipulation like with, Adobe Workshop or anything like that. It made it to the news program. It was on the 7 o'clock news the next night. And they even showed a few stills from the little kid's camera. And the whole conversation is there. The people are talking about it, and everybody's surprised. So the balls of light have been seen in an urban setting in the city.
That's bizarre. Dean, our time is almost up. So if somebody wants to get your book, Hollow Earth in the Puranas, how would they do that?
Well, probably they would go to Grave Distractions. That's written all together without any space. GraveDistractions.com. Just go to Google and write Grave Distractions, and you'll get it. And click on my name, Dean Dominic De Lucia. My books will pop up there. There's also the books of Michael J. Mott. He's written Cavern Cauldrons and Concealed Creatures, and he has a lot of information about the cavern worlds in the crust. Also, I'd like to invite your listeners to find the All Planets Hollow list, All Planets Together -Hollow, on Yahoo Groups, and join. We talk a lot about the Hollow Earth theory and come up with all kinds of evidence and arguments, and it's the place to be. It's the list that brings together all members of the Hollow Earth community. We're all there.
All those Hollow Earth people. That's pretty cool. Webpage, holloworbs.com, has a lot more information about what we talked about.
Sure, there's a section there. The Vedic Hollow Earth. There's also the Arctic Body of Evidence, Cavern Worlds, and a lot more.
A lot more. Dean, this was great. I feel like totally infused with new information. I love it.
Great. I'm happy that you're happy.
Well, okay. All right. Well, we need to go, and I am going to let you go. So thank you so much, and we will talk by Facebook or whatever real soon. Okay?
All righty.
All right. That was Dean Dominic De Lucia, his webpage, holloworbs.com, his book, Hollow Earth in the Puranas.
Piper of Hamelin. I mean, this is a fairy tale for children. It's in Grimm's fairy tales. But this was, I mean, they included it for children. They put it in their fairy tale book. But this existed before as a true account. It's just that it's been so long now. It's been something like 800 years that it's kind of difficult to verify. But some of the some of the characteristics of these stories we've heard before. The children were enchanted. There was some frequency that was employed. They were hypnotized. The mountain opened up. The children walked in. The mountain closed again. We've run across this before, even in the Tibetan folklore, about some of the entrances to the cavern worlds, how they've been closed up with boulders, and the people know where they are, more or less, but nobody goes there. They don't know how to open the door. They don't know what the mantras are, or the frequencies, that kind of thing. But are these stories really myth, or are they reality? It's just been so long.
Well, I mean, but there are even people that claim that in Dulce, New Mexico, there's an underground government installation, but inside that installation, there are beings or creatures that live there, that have lived there, and we just kind of found them and created some kind of an agreement that we could hang out with them.
Well, I don't know what the specifics are, but I have no doubt that these creatures live in these cavern worlds below the earth. And I know that our government and also the Russian government, they have been excavating and digging and establishing underground cities with black funds for a few decades now. I can remember reading about things like that in the 70s, these underground cities that they have. If you think about it, think about the continental drift theory. You've got these plates sitting on top of the crust, and apparently there's some movement. Well, the plates are not smooth. Of course, they're going to be jagged underneath. Imagine all the scratching and scraping that must go on. Certainly you're going to have hollows. You're going to have openings, caverns that open up, that are scratched out between these two surfaces because of the friction. And they're going to be maybe a mile or so high, and they're going to be maybe 25, 30, or maybe 50 miles long. That's not so incomprehensible. There's certainly water down there. And as far as the omnipresent light that we've heard so much about from Tibetan folklore, that could have a scientific basis too. Yeah, go ahead.
Explain that, because that's one of the places I always get stuck is, sort of using something that is luminescent in nature. How do they get light down there?
Well, first of all, there are some creatures that do not use photons. Their eyes are not sensitive to photons, or rather, they may be sensitive to photons, but they're also sensitive to other particles. Photons apparently bounce off the surface of the Earth because they are so small. But there are other particles that pass right through. So these cave entities that were found by the Russian patrol and also
Hello and welcome to Forbidden History Radio, where we explore humanity's hidden history, out-of-place artifacts, lost civilizations, and startling evidence that the truth is being suppressed.
Let me tell you a little bit about Dean and get him on the air because, as I said, I got this big list of questions. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about is the Hollow Earth theory, which we've tried to do before, but just has not moved forward. And so I think this is going to be really cool and interesting. Dean Dominic De Lucia studied business administration at the University of Baltimore and later on completed a 2-year course in translating at the Catholic University in São Paulo, Brazil, where he currently resides. He has maintained a lifelong interest in Indian/Hindu philosophy and spiritual practices, which ultimately led him to take up Vedic astrology. Dane maintains a unique perspective, one of presenting pure Vedic astrology in its original form without hodgepodging it with other systems. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio, the author of The Hollow Earth and the Puranas, his website, holloworbs.com, Dean Dominic De Lucia. Hey, Dean, how are you?
Well, Dr. Rita, I'm doing just fine. I'd like to thank you for bringing me on your show, and I'd like to say I think that I'm really going to enjoy it.
Well, good. I think it's going to be great. I am always prepared for all of my interviews. I always have, a handful of questions, and I sat down and started going through your material, and it was like, okay, here's another one. Oop, here's another one. Oop, here's another one. And like I said, I just barely, scratched the surface. So I'm really, I'm not really glad that Jerry's not feeling good, but I'm really glad that I have you for both hours because it'll give us more time to visit and go deeper into this whole topic, which seems kind of huge, but no one really knows about. So before we get into the whole thing, how did you become interested in the whole concept of a hollow earth?
Well, I was very interested in alternative astronomy, always. I have telescopes. I've had telescopes for maybe 20, 25 years now. And I'm one of I've always had an alternative perspective. I don't know, maybe I'm a bit of a wrangler or something. But even back in the 70s, I was very dubious about this whole Apollo idea. And, of course, I ran across the face on Mars, the Hoagland material like that. And I always used to peruse the Internet and look at alternative astronomy material. And then I found some material on the Hollow Earth, and I started reading about it. And it rang a bell. A few of the issues that I had with the Vedas, with specifically the Puranic literature, were answered by this idea of the Earth being hollow. And I decided to investigate it a little bit further, and I found out more than I ever imagined. Let's put it that way.
So when we say hollow, do you mean like empty, an empty?
So the Bigfoot, we're speaking about the Bigfoot here. Bigfoot has been seen. There's a wonderful, how would you say, a wonderful explanation of the Bigfoot in this book by Cremo, Forbidden Archaeology. In the appendix, he reproduces this Russian account of a Russian division that was in Afghanistan. This was back in the 1920s, because they also had some military activity in Afghanistan in the 20s. And this Russian division encountered some insurgents, and there was a battle, and the insurgents took to the mountains, they took to the caves, and they went deep in the caves. And they were met by a whole tribe of Bigfoot, and they had a battle inside the caves, and the Russians were outside, and they came running out, and they surrendered. They surrendered to the Russians. When they were being interrogated, they explained to the Russians, to their horror, what they encountered in these caves, the types of beings. The Russians went in there, and they found one of them shot dead, pulled him out. They had a doctor with him. The doctor conducted an autopsy. This thing was about 9 feet tall. It had whitish hair. It had a pinkish face. It had a face which was much more of a man's face, definitely a man's face, rather than a simian face or gorilla face, nothing like that. And, this was an autopsy signed by a medical doctor, and the general or colonel, whoever was this military officer. So this right there gives you an idea of how immediate our contact can be, has been at times, with these creatures living in cavern worlds right below our feet. Whereas the hollow world, is very far away. It's difficult to access, and I don't know. To me, it just seems more distant. It seems like something I'll never encounter. I'll never go there, but I know about it. Something like that.
The stories that you're sharing of these creatures that live in present day, I'll just say, they sound, I'm going to say, kind of kooky. Like, what have you been smoking this week? However, I have a big however. When you look at mythology, there are, as you say, there are stories upon stories upon stories of these subterranean worlds and these people that inhabit these realms, but then they just kind of stop talking about it. You don't hear about it anymore, so you figure, they just say all the mythology is a bunch of hooey anyway, and if you believe that the mythology is true, you must be crazy too.
Yeah, well, mythology, and I think a closer word to us would be folklore. These beings have always existed in folklore, in European folklore. And it's not. It seems so far away. Like it's turned into fairy tale. It's turned into myth. But it wasn't myth when these things were written down. It wasn't myth when these things were experienced by the people. There's a lot of them. I think we could talk about a few of them. Even the pied, for example, cats. Cats can see in the dark. Their eyes are apparently picking up on other particles down there. They have their sunshine, which is different from our sunshine, so to speak. So first of all, there's that. But then there's one Hollow Earth writer, and he's a physicist, Joseph H. Cater, and his theory is that these particles from the sun that pass through the Earth, of course they're electrons, but his theory is that electrons are actually made up of photons, and that as they pass through the Earth's crust, there is friction because of forces opposed, and they begin to fragment and break up. And this is what we hear from some of the few travelers, the few accounts that we have of people who have actually claimed to have accessed these worlds, that as you penetrate and as you go down through the Earth's crust, and we're talking about, maybe even like 25, 30 miles, we've heard some figures like that, that a certain luminescence, omnipresent luminescence, just starts to manifest. And this would be the particles from the sun passing through the Earth, breaking up into their constituent photons, and that would account for luminosity at a certain strata, at a certain level. So if you have an opening, if you have light, and if you have water down there working its way through the rocks and, in the middle of the Earth's crust somewhere, then why can't you have life? Those are all the ingredients.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about people that have actually gone to the center of the Earth, you're talking about the book, which I actually have read, which I thought was interesting, that Olaf Jansen guy.
Right, Olaf Jansen. Well, Olaf Jansen, he passed through with his father, Jens Jansen, he passed through the hollow opening in the middle of the Arctic Ocean into the cavity. And that's the illumination there is maybe a little different, but I'm speaking of actual cavern worlds, accessed through caves like that. There are various stories. The Makuxi Indians in Brazil, they have a whole folklore about their, how would you say, their origin being these underground worlds that they used to access once a year. They would travel down through the cave systems that they knew, and at a certain depth, this light would start manifesting. There's the book Etidorpa, which is Aphrodite spelled backwards, but that's the account of a man in Ohio. We actually think we know who he is, a Captain Henry Morgan, who was originally from northern New York, but he was abducted and he was brought on a journey through a tunnel system, and he passed through several cavern worlds, and he related that the force of gravity begins to diminish with depth as you pass through the crust, as you go very deep, and that also light begins to manifest, a certain luminescence, omnipresent luminescence just begins to manifest all around you. So these are the accounts that I was referring to. Olaf Jansen is very
fear, something like, when I think of it, the first thing that comes to mind is that book, Journey to the Center of the Earth, where they go down and they get to the middle of the Earth, and as opposed to being molten magma, it's, this got a little ocean and some trees, and there's kind of a sun in the background. That's the imagery that comes to mind. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, there are two concepts, and that is one of them, really, that the Earth is a cavity, that the Earth is hollow, the crust of the Earth is a shell, there are orifices, openings at the polar extremes, and inside the environment is actually very nice. That's what's been reported. Now, the other concept is a concept that we call cavern worlds. And cavern worlds are worlds within the crust, cities within the crust. Some of these have been reported by UFO abductees.
Which is a topic we're going to get totally into.
Sure.
Based on what you've read, which do you feel is more realistic, practical, or are you still on the fence? Is it a big hollow Earth, no magma core, or do you think it's more the subterranean realms, or could it be both?
Oh, no, definitely both. Definitely both exist. The one, how do you say, difference of opinion that I've had to juggle is which has a stronger, more immediate impact on us living on the surface of the Earth. And I definitely think that the cavern worlds concept the cavern world's reality, I'll put it that way, has a very direct and immediate impact on us living on the surface of the earth.
All right, I'm going to bite. Why would...
Okay.
I was kind of wanting to hold off on this piece of conversation. We will go here right now. Why would it have more of an immediate impact on us?
Well, because we're closer to those worlds, and I think we're more immediately accessible by them. For example, just to give one example, let's think about the chupacabras. Now, the chupacabras, they don't live in the clouds. Let's put it that way. They're not above us. They don't live in the sky, and to tell you the truth, they don't live around us either. Or else their habitat would have been discovered by now. There would have been more sightings, something like that. So if they're not above us and they don't have an existence laterally, where do they exist? Where do they live? They must live below. And in this way, there are many creatures that live below us in these cavern worlds. They've been typically reported in folklore, definitely in European folklore, and now I'm speaking about Tolkien. Now I'm speaking about goblins, I'm speaking about gnomes, I'm speaking about trolls, I'm speaking about fairies, I'm speaking about elves and their activities and their impact and their manipulations on or of the surface world, and also